Yeah, I want to say hi to Eric too. Hi, Eric.
Hey, Eric. Bruce, you want to say hello to Eric?
Hey, Eric.
Ralph?
Thanks for joining us. Eric, get off my lawn.
There you go. Sparky 107 wants to know how can he get to watch a modeler's life or listen to a modeler's life? How can
if he goes to amodelerslife.com, there's links there to the free site, which is Libsyn and iTunes, and there's other. You can get it on Google Play. He can get it on TuneIn and Spotify. But if he goes to the website, amodelerslife.com, there's links right there.
Zappa Gap.
Yeah. It's a CA type glue. Kevin said Flexifile plastic weld. And Ron was saying MEK.
No, I can use. No, I can weld with acetone. That works. It's beautiful. But I can't print this job in ABS. It has to be PLA.
So what I have here is, you'll see that I've got 9 different LEDs on here, and they're just kind of slowly changing. One comes on, one comes off. You know, it's kind of a slow pace. We could sit here all night watching this very slowly go, but you know, if you actually had these in windows in your different buildings, or even one in each different building, doesn't even have to be windows in the same building, then you'd want it to go this slow or maybe even slower. And that's about the only thing I'm going to have to show you in the sketch. So we're going to go back to that real quick. Or actually, let's build this thing first. So I just put it together so that you could see what we're going to end up doing. And what I'm going to do is just unplug my Arduino and tear this thing apart real quick.
How come there's Springfield playing on the other?
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Good evening, everyone. Welcome to YouTube Auto Builders Fine Scale live build for Tuesday, February 19th. So this month, we're going to pick up on the exterior details, talk about some of the things that I'm going to use and some of the things Ralph and Lloyd have used in their particular cases, and some stuff from Miles on exterior detailing to complete the structures that we've been working on. Probably have one more show around these structures before I have my set of structures that I've been working on complete. The next show coming up, we'll talk about some interior stuff. And I'll probably get a chance to show you some of the preemptive construction and assembly that I've been working on for that particular piece. And I've got some really interesting materials from Miles Hale models. There's a bunch of other companies that make pretty similar materials that are in an etched stainless steel, etched brass, or some other material. And there's been some really interesting movement on YouTube. Luke Towan's channel, for one, had showed a really, really good detailed description of how to use Micromark's kit for etching your own material. And I'm really enamored and fascinated with the idea of etching some of my own components. So the components that I've got are from this company, from Miles Hale Models. And the kit I'll show you that I've got broke apart in a moment. There's a couple kits, and I may work with some of the parts from the other one. This is a pretty spectacular kit. I have a copy of this one. And the biggest kit that I'm using the vast majority of parts out of is this one. You got to remember, all the parts we get are a box of parts. Use them however you want to. I'm definitely not using them in such an ornate fashion. Wouldn't be very appropriate on my particular layout, so I'm cutting them up to make stair components out of them. Has some pretty nice components with it. So now Ralph's done some work with, and Lloyd too, in different cases with some styrene components. Before we get into the brass, what do you think about, and even the wood laser cut parts, like Nick Masney's parts? Those look really incredible too. What's your instinct about that, Ralph?
Works best if I turn the mic on. I've haven't put Nick's together yet, but I have them, and I've had them out of the package, examined them. They are nicely cut, very fragile. So you have to be, it's like the Tichy ones that I did, the fire escape. It's really thin. Otherwise it wouldn't look right. But they're very well done. And I think it was only, I think it was about $10 that I paid for the fire escape from Nick. 10 or 15, I can't remember now, but you can't go wrong. I think I have them here.
And I've got some pictures of it in a moment. I'll pull those up. We could share those, show them in better detail. So I'll do that while you're looking for a moment. So here's a few pictures that Ralph had shared with us from these Tichy kits. It's always art. I mean, the art Tichy stuff's great. I mean, it's a spectacular resource of products that they have. But I like their rolling stock real well too.
And it went together really, really easily and very well. Not like some plastic stuff where you have to modify it to get it to fit. This fit beautifully. You'll notice on the bottom fire escape, I made it shorter, and that wasn't difficult to do. The ladders are long enough so that it goes up beyond the next level, so that you have, if it was real, you'd have something to hang on to go up and down the ladder. And they look realistic. Now all I have to do is weather them.
I like the styrene kits for that. I think styrene, I mean, some people think I kind of condemn styrene. I think styrene's a spectacular material. It just depends on what you're doing with it. And for emulating metal, styrene's about as good as anything. It's either that or like the etched material. You have one of a couple choices to do it well. And the laser cut material has got to a point recently. I mean, the Nix is some of the first from Imagine That Laser, some of the first that I've ever seen that were adequate in a wood or task board material.
Yeah, there they are there. It comes 4 levels on the one sheet. A fire escape 4-pack it's called. And that's what it looks like when it's put together. And it's actually quite good. It has the side handles on the ladder, so when you're going up and down, you got something to hang on to. And it's done on a probably about a 32nd of an inch plywood. So it's got some substance to it, but it's just when you get to the railings and so on, you got to be careful.
Well, it has to be.
It'll still break.
Absolutely. I mean, you couldn't get a wood material or task board material, but you could get it quite fine. But you're never going to get it to the etched metals. I just prefer the etched metal. I'm in favor of that. But I do like the styrene. I think you can emulate the texture and the consistency and stuff real well with that. Lloyd, you scratch built that one that you've got on the camera, right?
That's right. I was scratch built. Well, of course, I bought stairs, the stairs and the railing. Well, the yellow railing and the stairs were bought.
Can you make his window full screen?
And all the rest was built scratch. Yeah.
No, that looks. See, it's not that hard to put it together from styrene. I'll grant you that. I don't know that I would have just tackled such a project right off the bat, but that's pretty spectacular. And I had intended to build what I'm working with styrene components because I knew I was going to have to scratch build it. But I wanted to kind of mix a couple mediums together, given the era that I'm modeling and the kind of nature of the Appalachian town. So, using some cast iron, wrought iron railing systems is entirely appropriate from virtually any era until you get back to before the turn of the century. So metal railings, but it would be a little bit more uncommon to have metal walkways. So I did make wood walkways with those. With mine. So, and I've got a few things. I'll flip the camera down. Actually, Johnny, we've got a video. Miles Hale had done some work with his edge material. If you could let us know when you could play that for us. We'll play this brief video that's on Miles' channel. Any of you guys that are watching should go check out his channel anyway, Model Railroad University, and you can watch this video, which we'll play it in its entirety for the few minutes length that it is. Because he's got an etched metal system in O scale, of course, and on a building flat. So it was a pretty spectacular job.
Well,
in a moment. Yes, sir.
Just before, this is another staircase that I scratch built from styrene. This is, yeah.
There you go.
And this one is all scratch built.
Was that going between levels and scenery, levels between track, or something like that, right?
Yeah. Well, okay. It's yeah. It's going to be like that. Where here it's going to be going to a train station, an RDC train station.
Sure.
And that's from the street. So, yeah, they have to go up the stairs to go on the platform.
You see constructions like that all the time in the real world, but that's just a virtually impossible thing to buy a kit for that properly recreates what you see in the real world with all that variability. Undoubtedly, there's a lot of this stuff has to either be scratch built or cut together. Which I'm cutting these components I've got are not intended to be used the way I'm using them.
What era again are you modeling, Lloyd?
The 70s.
70s. I'm thinking back to the train station we used to have down on the lakeshore. The roadway and station was above the tracks by about 20 feet. And there were stairs going down to it, but they also had an elevator. Because in those days, they also had porters to take your stuff down, right? So if you had a lot of baggage, you wouldn't want to take it down the stairs.
Mm-hmm. But that was mainly, like, this one here is, like I said, it's for RDC, so it's just going from one town to the other.
Go for it.
Hi, welcome to the Kansas City Terminal Railroad. I've talked a lot about my building flats here, and most of them are exactly that, flat. But a lot of them have the fire escape detail as a part of the photograph. And one person that watched one of my videos said, you know, if you didn't have that fire escape on and you put a three-dimensional one on, it certainly would add a lot to it. It would give it that three-dimensional element that you're looking for. So that's what I've done here. I've got a Chooch casting. This is actually a casting, not a building. It is a flat, but it's an actual cast building. I put in some photographic windows, and then I came back and I used, in this case, a milepost models kit. Now this is an old kit that I've had around for probably 20 years or more. It's brass, it is a fire escape, and I really like using my soldering machine, so I decided I'd make this up. I had 3 or 4 of these kits are laying around, and go for it. So this is all the brass solderings. Now what I had to do though was figure out how am I going to space this out and make it look right, because I always go back on the adage Americans like things square and neat and clean. So how am I going to keep this perfectly clean and neat and square? Well, what I did was I went over and I made a template. I taped this onto my model, did a rubbing with my pencil so that I could see where the windows are, cut them out, made sure it fit. Then I took this and I put it on a board, mounted it on a piece of 1/4-inch plywood. And then, because these are the actual spacings of the windows, I was able to make the marks here upon which I was able to line up my landings exactly. And I put pins in the bottom corners of my landings, stuck them onto my board, which has this template on it. Then I was able to take my ladder castings and ladder assemblies and put them in here and figure out exactly how long they had to be and where they needed to be cut, and I could solder them in place. When I was done, I had an assembly all complete and ready to go to put on, and I took that out and I painted it. Then I took my template and I pasted it back on, taped it back onto my model, and that gave me the hole locations for my pins, my locator pins here that are holding each one of these platforms in place. This is held by 6 pins, 1 on each, or 2 on each of the platforms. And I simply reapplied that back onto my model, taped my ladder up here on top, and voila, I have a finished fire escape. So the secret here is the template. Be sure to make a paper template so that you know where everything's going to line up. And I think you'll have a fun time doing this. You could also use the Titch Titchy plastic fire escape, which comes in both HO and O. I think they even make it in N scale. So you could do that in almost any scale. But using that template allows you to work on your workbench, line everything up, and then apply it to your model. I hope you'll give it a try. Hope we see you in 2018 here in Kansas City. And in the meantime, go down to your train room, let your trains put a smile on your face.
So he did the laser cut. That's a good video to go watch if you're working on this laser cut stuff or this etched metal components. You don't have to solder them. It's possible to use a CA glue of any description, whatever, thick or medium. Hold them together. You'll probably want to use a medium or a thin. The components are fairly small.
If it's stainless steel, you're going to have to use glue. If it's brass, you have a choice. You can solder it or use the CA.
Absolutely. And actually, a whole lot of the etched parts I have, all the detail parts that I use on my track work are all stainless steel, and that's impossible to solder. Now, I'd love to have a resistance iron. I do have the benefit of an air iron, and I'll show you that here in just a minute. We'll talk about soldering. I prefer to solder them. It's a little bit of a different technique than working with electronic soldering, and I've got all the various things. So a couple things that you need rulers. That's my favorite scale rule in the world. Micro scale has this transparent, flexible scale rule, 187 scale. That's a pretty spectacular trick. I got a metal one, and that's handy too, but I really much prefer the flexible one I can throw over top of whatever I'm working on. At the end, blades of whatever description, of course. Exacto's handy. That's my favorite for most of these parts because you can make a straight down cut. You're going to work on glass. I'm working on glass below this for most of that. Also, most of the woodwork stuff that I do, I use these for a lot of everything. Pretty handy. I'll show you what I've built for a platform in a moment that we'll put the soldering on. One last thing before I put this away. Last month we had finished the brick coloration, but it's not possible or not easy to be able to do the border lines. The border lines that I've done on mine so far, it's the best example of that piece. The camera doesn't do it that much justice, but the border lines that I've done, and I use gesso, artist gesso, because it's got a bit of a particulate. Now, I've seen people do it with spackle, which also I like that effect really well too. And spackle has a particulate in it as well, either a vinyl compound or a plaster.
Try an oil wash; it'll go on better.
I've done it with paint several times of various types, and I don't dislike the paint. The paint's fine. And if I worked in end scale, or if I was working with plastic, I just about assuredly would use paint, a thin paint wash to do this. But working with wood, I really like working with something that has some bite to it, it's a texture built into it. So since we're going to solder, I'm going to work with two different techniques or two different mechanisms to solder tonight. I don't unfortunately have a resistance iron. I've looked at them for years, but I've never been willing to ante up. So any soldering iron will do the job. This one's a bit dirty. I use it more for scenery and shaping trees than anything else, but that's got a chisel tip on the end of it, flat chisel tip. That's almost essential for doing as a soldering tip, almost essential for doing track work and a whole lot of electrical work. But for doing these smaller detail parts, that's not my preference. Anything with a really pointed pencil tip is my preference. You can get these standalone Weller irons for $30, give or take, probably US. So it doesn't have to be an expensive investment, but a soldering iron is going to be essential anyway. And one of the things I prefer about the Weller is it's so much easier to change the tips out. You can get a wide range of tips, and it's a lot easier to find compatible tips for a Weller than it is for some of the other brands. Now, none of them are hot right this second. And they get hot real quick depending on the iron. And that's one of the variations. In these that are straight, just irons with cords on them, they take a little longer to warm up. This iron is a part of my soldering station. It has, this will be easier. The best way I could do is to put it over here behind me. So this has the pencil iron. And this is, you could buy a Weller station, and I looked at them, but they're quite a bit more expensive to buy a Weller station of the same description. So this is an Xtronic station. Not an expensive station, a couple $100 tops, and you can get them with air, hot air, for under $100 if you don't worry. This has a sweat station, so I can blow hot air up through the bottom. It'd be pretty good if you could get all the, for scenery work, it would be good if you could get all the parts and components together, like a brass freight car kit or something. You could probably use this for, and it has a position to hold the air. This is my favorite contraption in the world. And for a whole lot of detail parts, that's my favorite thing coming and going, especially with solder paste. But I think tonight we'll use the smallest solder that I have that's not a silver solder. But that's my favorite technique, or my favorite tool. And this will get to full tip with any of these standard stations, be it Weller or Xtronic. That'll get to full air tip in 10 seconds, give or take, and the iron will be up to tip in It takes longer for the metal to equalize than it does for the core to actually get to tip. And then the best trick that there is for soldering, especially when you're working with this, with some of the wiring, you could get away. You're going to use a lot more solder, and you could be a little less refined with your technique. So it would definitely be better to refine your soldering techniques with wire and electronics components first, in my opinion, prior to working with structural things that will have visible solder joints on them. And everybody has these little contraptions you can buy on Amazon for $20 that have the mesh in them. You can buy a dozen of these things for $6 or $8, and it's the same thing, copper mesh. So that's pretty handy for cleaning a tip. For most electrical work where you're going to feed a lot of solder into that, it's not going to be as particular, and your iron will be tinned as a part of that process. And iron maintenance isn't as critical. For some of this detail work, iron maintenance and having a nice clean tip is going to be pretty important to your process if you're using a tipped iron. Now, what we're working on and where I'm at with my construction. So I've removed it tonight to work with it. It's a diorama section that removes from the layout. In the back section, and I've got much of the internal construction ahead of next month's show. I've got much of that complete down here, walls, doors. That wall is still yet to be studded. I've got HL scale 2x4s for that interior wall. Where these are cut off, you can see the floor joists free hanging at the angle slices as the building is just sliced through for where the fascia is. So you'll be able to see through this structure, see through the front of it to the shoe store up front. I've got glass. I've got the glass placed in this. Probably need somebody to do windows, but I don't do windows. But the real glass is much more reflective. I'm a real fan of it. Although this is one of the hardest things I've done with it, trying to get this refined to cuts to get them to fit in between all of those plastic components. That was pretty tedious. Now, if you were not going to view this from the inside, and you could just lap the glass over the edges or whatever, just lap it over the edges. Mine had to set down inside a groove on each one. And I even had to carve a groove in these side windows here. I had to carve a little slot for them to set in. And it was a patience trying, to say the least. These floors, which they'll remain removable so you can work on the inside. And then in a moment, I'll show you the decking that I built. I built that deck. And it's individual boards, so it free hangs out there, because I don't get the same results just scoring or marking, but individual boards. I'll show you how I cut those in a quick, easy way in a moment too. And then it has lights fed under the surface material for the roofing above. But individual boards, and then run a wash over it. It didn't show up very good. It kind of defeats the point of having the individual board construction if you don't run a little wash of either a thin paint or, in my case, I used the 100-line stains, which I admit I've kind of got lazy because of those stains. I pretty much just use them for like everything. Scenery.
Yeah, an interior floor, at least the interior wood floors that I have in my house, are shiny.
Oh, no question.
If you want your wood grain to really pop, then it should be shiny, because it brings out the grain in the wood.
Oh, no doubt about that. And in other places where I've done hardwood floors, that in a more traditional space, I would absolutely put a gloss clear coat over those. In this case, this being the top floor, it's a storeroom, and in 1950, that's pre-plywood. So, plywood was not a standard building component, and even paneling was not a standard building component until at least the late 50s, if not up into the 60s. So most everything was plank construction, much of it being rough lumber. Even on the interior of brick structures, there was still a whole lot of stuff that was cut at the local sawmill. So that top floor being a storeroom needs to be fairly rough. Now downstairs, I'm still undecided about floor textures, and I'm playing with some techniques for carpet. And I'm reasonably happy with some of the techniques, but they're all exaggerated. It's just whether I can get that exaggeration down to a point I can be happy with. While I'm at showing the module what I've got done, I did finish up all the exterior detailing stuff, at least up here. I've got more structures to fill in here, but I've got the end of the module complete. I've got a little building that sits there, and a brick pad, and I got all of the border lines finished on all of the structure, and I done this with the gesso as well. So I had a primer coat of gray, dot on the gesso with a where I left some of the brush texturing, pouncing the brush into it to stippling the brush texture to get some texture, because you can't see much of it, but it's there. It's a very subtle effect to having any texture whatsoever, like the gesso has. But I can tell the difference in it and just paint effects. Granted, part of this is I'm not artistic enough to pull off every effect with just paint alone. But if I use texture, I get some of the natural benefits of, optics and light. So that's where I got to with that one. This end of the modules, or this diorama that fits in and it locks in place to the road up here. It's pretty much complete until I build a few more structures to finish this.
What's going into that big rectangular opening?
Okay, so tonight we're going to start working on some of the components that go to that. That's going to finish my exterior parts. For that, I've built a deck platform. And I built that part of the component out of wood. So let's show you what I've done there. So I've been chopping on little pieces of wood, and I've stopped at a point where I could easily show you what I've worked on and show you how I cut some of the pieces together. So I put it on glass. So it's framed just like the interior walls of that building that I just showed you. They're studded just like a house wall would be studded on 16-inch centers. Another trick that I find when I'm doing board by board construction, what's worked well for me, and these are, as you can see, that even the planks on top are 8-foot long planks, everything done to scale, is I'll do as few of cross members as I can get away with until I put the surface boards in. It's much easier to position it and much easier to get good glue on those surface areas. So, because you get a different process of gluing. So once this is complete, I'll go back and put that every 2 feet, because you should have cross members every 2 feet. These are every 4 feet now. Once all the top decking is on, I'll come back every 4 feet. But I wanted as little material to work with, just where you need the boards. So these light up every 4 feet to make all the steps in the breaks of the 8-foot boards. Now, at the moment, it's hard to tell, and the camera doesn't do it enough justice, of course. It's hard to tell a lot about that's individual boards. It's not that dissimilar to just these individual. And what I use for most of this stuff is this cedar veneer. It's super thin. You can get a lot of different styles of this material. For example, I've showed this to a couple of people, and I've got some veneer like this. This is a thin veneer, and it's a Christmas card made out of wood. That's oak. A quite thin oak, treated to be quite flexible. I've built a lot of stuff out of these, and these are pretty handy. You can just get the material, obviously, without it being a greeting card. This is what really excited me about what we could do with some of these veneers. Is 3 or 4 years ago, one of my clients sent me a card much like this. I cut it up and used it. This is my 4th one since I've been modeling, and I have cut each one of them up to use them. They're quite spectacular, but they're not as thin as these cedar veneers. These come from the same guys that make the window glass that I use, the real glass, Sierra scale models. And their window glass is pretty incredible, quite a bit finer than the microscope. Even the microscope cover slides, nearly half as thin as the microscope cover slide. So the veneer. Now, I've got to chop it, little Northwest short line chop it, and they're handy. And they do make another contraption that does this kind of elongated slit process. Johnny also has a little thing that I find quite fascinating that is used quite commonly in the RC model space, I think, and for stripping down, and it's a little machine. Now, if you had enough thickness of material, I think I could get away with one of those. But this thing being about as thick as, a heavier weight paper like you'd use for a business presentation or something like that. It's not greeting card thickness by no stretch of the imagination. Slightly thicker than good paper, like good stationery. It's about that thick. Now, I've tried to cut it a bunch of different ways. But because it's so thin, even most of the rulers that have the cork on them, which I despise, I need to find more of these rulers that don't have cork on them. But even with the cork, you can't cut an edge on it because it falls up under the edge of the cork. It's too thin. But and you can find what I end up doing. I've done it a couple different ways. I've glued pieces together. I've chopped pieces to length. It's easier if there's a little bit of material on either side. So a couple pieces of material to hold the ruler off is what I've been doing, and cutting strips this way. And then I have I use some spacer and then cut strips. So I make up a kind of assembly that exposes just a little bit of material, but even then it's quite difficult. X-Acto works pretty good, of course. Use an X-Acto for about anything, especially if you ask Miles. That's like the perfect tool for absolutely everything. It cuts fine with that. These work so well for a lot of things. Now, if you're cutting that have a straight blade in them, boy, the blades are a lot cheaper, and you can find them real readily in packs of 100. I cut a lot of the etched metal components that way too, because you can make a downward movement. The problem with trying to cut a lot of this wood material in a traditional way as you would with an X-Acto with a dragging motion is that the wood has a grain to it. It tends to pull the blade along. And unless I have missed something and have not found the right technique for how to keep it from doing that, no matter how hard I try to push it to one side, could sometimes follow as a grain. And even though it's quite subtle and I don't always notice that it happens, as I work across a sheet, ripping it, cutting it down to get the little slivers of material, I find that I've slowly drifted off and got little wider, little narrower pieces. So I've had better luck just using a straight blade.
It would help if you turned your ruler over. It has a cork on the bottom.
Uh-huh.
That cork is there to stop it from moving while you cut.
No doubt. The problem I've had with the cork, and I could use the cork possibly on this side, but it puts my blade, if I flip it over this way, it puts my blade so high up above the material that the blade wants to drift around under the edge.
But the blade doesn't, it's not going to drift around during the edge. If you, instead of holding it on a high angle, take it down lower and follow the edge of the ruler.
Yeah, I've done that quite a bit. I've had the best luck doing that too, pitching the blade at 20 degrees or something, quite low. And I thought about trying some of the other different blades. Of course, I've got some of those variety packs like everybody does that have some of the curved and hooked and various blades. Some of those are fairly handy, but the vast majority of, a number 11 or a chisel blade. I'm a big fan of a chisel blade, but that straight down chopping movement has worked considerably well too. Now, what I like about this too is when I'm doing etched components. So there are techniques, there are tools rather, flush cutters, of course, but there's also there's a tool that's more specifically, like the standard flush cutters we use, buy jewelry supply tools most of the time. Zuron's like we use for track cutting. That's not a model railroad's tool supply company, by the way. That's a jewelry tool supplier. It just so happens to have become popular with model railroaders. It's the same as any other tool that you'll find in a jewelry department. You use flush cutters to break the etched metal components from the brackets, but it's always going to leave a bit of an edge on the components. I've filed most of mine clean. So,
and it's also going to damage your blade on your cutters. Stainless steel does.
Absolutely, stainless steel for sure. Brass is a bit softer, and I'm not as concerned with it. But I have multiple sets, and I mark them accordingly, like cutting pins and such. So, like here in a few minutes, I'll need to use a pin vise because I want to put some of the railing on this outside edge. That's why I went ahead and finished that far down the material. You could use like a number 80 drill bit, but all I've done is used a needle in a pin vise, and it's just barely sticking out, just enough to make the indentations. If you're putting nail holes in board batten siding or something, that's probably what you'd use. And I don't use a straight pin. They're not. Well, a straight pin's quite strong, but you don't want to use something like a T pin generally. The pointy end of it is not very smooth if you look at it close up. And it's also not nearly as straight in the metal or tempered. Like a needle is a pretty doggone precise piece of straight material to work with. But it's really tough to cut. So I use a dedicated set of electrical dikes or something to break those because they're pretty tough. Now, I imagine most of the same stuff applies with wood, which I use wood glue. This is my favorite little thing I've been doing recently with wood glue is pre-diluting and using it. I got this little needle applicator bottle somewhere, one of the hobby shows or something. That's pretty good for doing this small work. You don't want to dilute it very much, though, and it is pretty hard to get it to go through the needle, so it's not perfectly convenient like a white glue would be, but it still works pretty good. Better to use it a brush. Now, in my case, the trick is I'm not using this as intended. I'm not very good at such things, and I rarely use them the way they're intended. So I'm going to cut these components up. In my case, I need a set of stairs about that long. That is the stringers for the stairs, also in brass. They come as a part of that kit, and they're not even intended to be used with that kit. Ken Hamilton, who runs that site, when he made these up, he just on the extra material that comes with those, that's how there's some extra components you could use. So of all scrap that you would save with plastic, I save the brass scraps for sure. And if nothing else, you need to practice your soldering some probably anyway. So I'm going to end up with a set of stairs like that, and I need to get railings for those stairs. So in that case, I'm going to use these components and cut each of the side rails out of them and solder those together. There's a few pieces that come with that kit, and it's the only kit he had that had these components. Now he does, if you happen to be an O-scaler, he makes a kit much closer to what I actually need per se, at least not the stairs, but for the upper handrails, than what is available in HO scale, already available in the kit. And I reached out to him, so he may be able to get some of those parts at HO scale eventually, but at the moment, I'm working with what I've got. So I need a handrail that goes down this entire porch system. So on this structure, I'll show you where this goes. So on this top floor, to your question about this exposed area, where I offset the buildings to change the configuration of the buildings quite considerably, I'm going to put there'll be a platform or a walkway across the front. I turn the side a little bit further so that I have I have a brass ladder that has the hook on the top that come with the fire escape system. I'll use that over here, and then the staircase. This staircase brings you down to this level here. But pretty hard to tell until it's completely built. But to make it look like something that was built and not really run down in 1950, the wrought iron railing systems were pretty popular. So there'll be a roof over top of this. This will be entries into 3 separate apartments, 3 or 4 apartments, something like that. And I'm going off from, I don't know exactly what the back of these buildings looked like in 1950. So this is one of the places where even as prototypical as I try to be, I don't know, and I haven't been able to find evidence as to what was actually there. So I get to be creative. I get to do what all the freelancers do.
Don't forget the clothesline with the clothes on it.
I've got that. I've got some clothesline.
Hanging from the corner to the railing.
That's right. I've got quite a bit of that actually. Bar Bills sells, interestingly enough, etched metal clothes, quite thin, that you can bend around to get all the various contours of clothes blowing in the wind. Shirts and pants and sheets and various little socks hanging on it. It's an etched metal string a couple inches long with etched metal clothes hanging on it to paint. So I've got some of those. I may very well use them here. They come with a tenement building for Bar Bills, but you can buy them independently for Bar Bills for a few bucks as well. So we've got to figure out where to cut these. Figure out how much overlap they need. Figure out how to line all the posts in some way that I can make sense out of how to use this stuff and where to cut it. Okay, if we use all of that piece, then I need to save one piece. Okay. Let's see, that goes back to... The good thing about just using a straight blade, this stuff's so thin. I mean, it is brass, but it's so thin. And like the stainless steel parts, detail parts that I use for doing track work, they're so incredibly thin that you can just pop a blade straight through the components and they peel away without anything at all left over. And you can make a real clean butt joint between the components without any filing. Of course, you have to file it once you get some solder on it. Speaking of that, we'll go ahead and put these couple pieces together. Now, I've done a few of the pieces so far already by putting them down on paper tape. Of course, using hot air, it's going to damage the tape real fast, so you have to be in and out pretty quick. But, and you can work on glass, again, if you work fairly quickly. In my case tonight, so I can hold heat on it, don't worry about it. I've tried to hold down a piece of baker's paper or whatever. We'll get these pieces to stay in place. I use spray glue for 1,000 things. Stick them down and peel them up later. Trick will be keeping it straight. Now, when I'm working on a lot of the small electrical parts I like to work with, I use a little set of clamps and stuff, these little hand things that everybody has. It has little clips on them. I try my best to get the brass work that I'd worked with already into those clips to be held in position. I just never could make that work. The only way I can figure out how to do it is just glue them down long enough to do the soldering. If you have an iron, and if you're working with an iron, then you'll have to not drag your iron the way you would typically do if you were doing track work. You typically want to drag the iron along your material. It's a good technique when you're doing track work or electrical work because the solder will follow the temperature, will follow the heat. it doesn't work well when you're working with small detail parts. So you have to use a pick and put spot. That should hold down enough that I can. So if you're working with an iron, for that matter, if I can get it in position, you can see well enough. I'll bring the iron and the air both up to tip, and we'll work with them both ways. Now, one of the keys to soldering anything, electrical or otherwise, is cleanliness. There's a clean surface for the solder to bond to. It won't bond to a dirty surface. Now, most people tell you have to use flux, and they think of flux as a flow improver. It is. I won't disagree with that. But I think of flux as a cleaner, and it is. It's an acid, and it cleans your work surface. So what do you use flux? But alcohol is almost essential too. That's doing any solder work. I wash everything with alcohol that I'm about to solder before I ever put flux on it.
But the difference is flux makes your solder paste flow. Alcohol doesn't.
Oh, I use them both. I just clean my surface with alcohol flux. But I wouldn't for just anything. I'm not going to clean wire with it. But if I was working, I've handled these. You've got a lot of oil, the oils in your skin and stuff really mess up a lot. I mean, just the same thing as when you're working with paint. Have you left marks in anything you've ever painted from oil or from handprints? Ever left?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I've learned to use gloves.
Yeah, of course that works well.
And I don't get just any latex glove. I get the black ones, which are meant to stand up to a lot more.
That's the difference in the black versus. I think most of the ones I've got a box of clear ones. I think AG said the box of purple ones that I've got are supposed to be better gloves.
Well, if you go to a mechanic, car mechanic, you're going to find most of the mechanics are wearing the black gloves.
That would make sense, especially in their particular use case. Now, for most electrical work, depends on what I'm doing, of course, to do different things. But for a lot of the electrical work, I would prefer a liquid solder. I really like that ruby red stuff that's become popular in the last few years. It is pretty good. I can't seem to get the stuff to stay, or enough of it to stay next to these components. So I tried initially, I painted it with some ruby red, and I couldn't really tell the difference in whether I had or hadn't done it. With these parts, I've had better luck using a paste. But gloves would be good since the parts are sticking to me more than they're sticking to the wax paper. And if you're using an iron, paper tape works pretty well for holding them down. Oh, if anybody in the chat or anybody that sees this comment on it has a good recommendation for a board that a person could solder these kind of components on, it wouldn't just absorb all the heat away.
Gaffa Haynes says flux has a solvent that also pit the surface, allowing the solder to adhere better.
Huh. I wonder what was happening microscopically with the pitting process. That's been one of my arguments with people about soldering for years. Anything you have got to wash it after the fact. That's why alcohol is so handy. Buy these little $2 or $3 little alcohol dispensers are just indispensable. I mean, they're a couple bucks, and if it's sitting there, you're a lot more likely to use the thing. And this would just come off Amazon, and you just tap the top, and it squirts a little bit more into the top, so you can tap your brush into it or whatever. So. Now, so working with an iron first. Solder I've got a pile of this stuff of various sizes. This is 15 thousandths, 0.015. I've got a few. There's a lot of sizes of solder. A few that are smaller. I've got some silver solder that's pretty substantially smaller, and I really like silver solder for some applications. Doing points, crowbars on turnouts. I'm a big fan of silver solder. It is a pain. It is a lot more trouble. Undoubtedly, it's a lot more trouble. But it's tremendously more solid. Now, argue with me that it may not be worth the trouble. And I really couldn't argue that point, that whether it's worth the trouble or not. But I don't know if I've ever broke one of the silver solder joints. I did that years and years ago with some of the first headlight crack I'd ever done. And we used silver solder. I'd never seen one of them break at the solder joint from wear and tear. I seen them being abused by somebody. So those couple points. Now, I wish I could show it more closely in a way that you could see. You want so little solder. All I'm doing is heating the brass up and applying a little bit of solder to the brass. I do not let the solder touch the iron. It tends to produce a bit of a bubble when that happens. Now, we'll do it with hot air in a moment too for the bottom section. Show you the difference in the two methods. A pointed tip iron is fine for doing this other technique. You just need to pick and set when you're moving around. And like every other technique in modern railroading, there's a debate to be had as to the proper technique of working with solder. When doing electronics, you get away with a lot more. In this case, I don't let the solder touch my iron. I don't do that with electronics either, for the most part, except, for the most part. But for these parts, if you just get the material hot, then feed a little bit of solder to the hot material, very little bit of solder. And if you have a hard time controlling it and you're finding that your solder is producing a spot, even if you're doing electrical, dropping feeders on your rails and you're getting too much, cut a little piece of solder off with your flush cutters, an 1/8 inch little length of small solder, and hold it in place with tweezers, or push it down in there against your rail joiner or against your feeder, and then just hit it with the iron. You can't over solder if there's only a small little drop of solder there. Now, I've been looking at those considerably, and I like. Okay.
Yeah, I got a question from Tim S. I do my soldering work on a slab of marble. That this is a flat surface and tends to keep things cool.
And for working with these kind of components, I've looked at those for years and thought about getting one of those, but it absorbs heat. So I solder on glass a lot, but that's risky. So I want to stay clear of recommending that in this video. Just don't do that. Don't solder on glass. I do it all the time. I love working with it, but you have to be in and out spectacularly quick. And I think that's the key to soldering in general. If you're putting a feeder on, if your iron was to that surface more than a couple of seconds, you're going to have a 2 or 3 second kind of, it's a quick move. Get everything in place right. Another reason why I like using the tweezers and a little piece of solder held in spot. You just lay the heat to it real quick. All right. Well, maybe let me do it here. Okay. Now you could, if you've already got a pretty decent soldering iron, you could get an air iron for $50 or something, just a standalone air iron. if you're going to do turnouts, fast tracks or otherwise, I couldn't imagine. I've never done them this way previously until I got this contraption, but I fell in love with soldering this way. And it puts out, in this case, 480 degrees C. So the only tricks you want to stand back from it pretty good. But I've soldered things that there's no way I could have done with an iron. Fixed some things for Angie, a bird cage that was about 3 feet tall. It had subcomponents that were probably a 1/4 inch round, give or take. I could have never done that. Now the tape is. And all I did is heat. Oh. Let's try to do that again. So it's going to burn the paper some, so be it. And if you're pushing much air through it, with these devices, you control the airflow independent from the temperature. So I often work with it with the airflow actually quite low. Gosh. Now. Paper moves around, wants to bend the pieces. That'll go back down to tip pretty quick, and then that'll go off. In just a second, when that's cold enough to the touch, I'll show you guys. And what we probably ought to talk about briefly before we run out of time tonight, the only step that I have to do to complete the railing around the fence. Next month when we come back, I'll show you this one complete. The only part I've got to do is punch holes. Now, like I said, you could drill them. That's probably a number 76 or 74, probably the same bit that I use for grabs. I would say it probably is. I use a smaller grab probably than a lot of people do. Now, I've tried marking this stuff and punching holes in it, but for some reason the marks vary just a touch. They always end up varying just a touch. If the marks vary a touch and then you move around on that a little bit, it's one of those things like cutting the individual pieces with an X-Acto. I found that little errors added up and added up and added up. Well, I'm not a fan of CA generally. I can't imagine another type of glue. What else could you use? CA is about it. What'd you say, Ralph?
You could use canopy glue.
You think that would grab a hold of? Because I sure like working with canopy glue better.
Yep. You don't have to worry about gluing your your finger to your eyebrow.
Yeah, it does make for some good stories, though. Did in Lionel's case. But I'm not a fan of CA, generally speaking. I mean, if I cut myself, CA is what I'm going to go for. But in modeling, everything I do with it, it always gets so brittle.
So which CA are you using? The thin or the gel?
I've got some gel, gap filling, thick, whatever, and I've got some thin. Depends on what I'm doing, of course, which application I'm going to go for.
The thin runs too much, but if you have to use it, I think we talked about this once before. Take an old sewing needle, like a hand sewing needle, and cut the tip off the eye where the thread is. And then what I do is I take that needle and I stick it in the eraser of a pencil, and you end up with this. Let's see if it'll show. So it's like two little fingers. So you dip that in your glue, and then you go over to your work and you put it on the work. and the capillary action holds the glue in between those two little fingers. And then you go refill it and another dab. That's if you have to use the thin stuff. You can't use this with the gel. And the easy way to clean it is you just take your X-Acto and just easily, you know, once it's dry, once the stuff's dry, you can clean it out. Or you can stick it in acetone if you want. But I choose to stay away from the chemicals if I can.
Yeah, I hate working with a lot of the chemicals that we work with. I would love to find an alternative. There's a lot of these techniques that I haven't found a good way to work to reproduce in the absence of some of the chemicals. I understand the need for caution with the vast majority of them. And I couldn't recommend more to people to be quite cautious with some of this stuff we work with. I mean, even EVK that we, you know, all the plastics glues that so many of us use, that stuff's pretty rough.
The other thing you can do, you can get these little plastic head that'll go on top of your glue bottle. And it takes it down to about a 1/64 of an inch opening.
Yeah, the
applicator. It takes it down to a long, thin funnel, and it's easy to apply that way. But they plug up easily, so.
Yeah, I need to file that, but that's, you know, even as thin a material, as that is, it's still pretty shiny. I got a little drip of solder at the bottom of it too, but I need to go back and do some filing on it, and I'll straighten that up because there's a little bit of material on it, but it's about impossible to get it. You'll see a little solder on it, but like when I do rails and feeders, I solder them. I get plenty of solder on there. I just file it all back down. And honestly, I may not even glue that, but I know if I do, it'll definitely be canopy glue. I don't like messing with the CA. And with the needle hole, those are so tight that the railings will stay on there without doing anything much more to them. Well, the last things I have to do that I probably should mention that is bending any of this stuff. I'd like to have an actual something that was more like a brake, but the couple pieces I've bent so far, working on some fencing or some gates actually that come with the kit, was bending them around using a straight blade as a brake, just bending up against that. And if you're gentle, it won't cut through. I'm not punching through it; it's just bending to make a quarter. So going around the end of this porch rail, I'll have to turn that back that direction. In that case, I will set the blade. It worked just like an aluminum brake would work. And you can get a perfect exact right angle. You'll never get it trying to bend it unless you do use a fixture to do that, but you'll get it pretty well. Yeah, a little bit more adjustment, straighten it up, but otherwise you'll get a pretty well perfect 90-degree angle. Adjustment where it leaves the quarter from, but that'll make a piece to go around that top quarter. Have you worked with any of the edge stuff? I know you've worked with some of it, Ralph, right?
I have, and a lot of the military guys, they have these little brakes for bending it, and it's basically all it is a clamp. So you have these two edges, one sticks out further than the other, and you clamp this down on your work, has little thumb screws on it, and then you use your blade to lift it up.
Yep, to hinge it up into position.
And the edge of it is cut on a 45 or a 60, so that you can go a little bit beyond 90 if you have to. Yeah,
I may look at getting one of those if I'm going to work with a lot of this. I I've ordered enough.
They're not cheap.
No, none of that. I looked at some of this stuff, and it's
3/4 inch one here in Canada is about $60, and to get one that's 6 or 8 inches is $105. I looked into it and I said, nah, I think I'll just use the straight edge and a blade.
It works. For what I've done so far, what I may end up doing, that'll work. At such a point as it ceases to work, I'll look at getting a tool for doing a better job of that. So far, doing handrail, fencing, most of the things that I'm going to do with a brake so far, I could probably get away without a brake. But
the only thing you have to be careful of is that you're actually bending it up 90 degrees, not twisting it. So it's better to work on a piece of graph paper if you can, so that you know where 90 degrees is, and you lay out your railing, say, on one of the lines of the graph paper. Yeah, you lay out your ruler on the opposite line, and now it's going to bend properly. Otherwise, it might be off slightly.
Oh, and it would go real awry if you did. There's no question about that. All right, everyone, thanks for joining us this month. Some handrails. Next month, I'll have mine finished up across this handrail system, across this balcony. I'll finish up the flooring on that. And we're going to get into some interior details, especially with some of the really interesting stuff that Lloyd's been doing lately with his interiors. And Miles has some pretty spectacular interiors. Lloyd and Ralph done, all of us with the interior work. Most of my construction is I've got most of my interior walls constructed, ready to do the detailing on. Oh, how far have you made it on yours, Ralph? What you got?
Well, this is half of it. So I've got it all put together with the wood strips. Each one of these panels was separate. So I'm doing the weathering on it now.
Oh, that's stone work. Gosh, I just can't imagine. With brick, I understand the argument with wood, or I like the wood laser cut brick, and I like the hydro cut brick.
This is still wet, so.
But the stone.
This to me was a mistake, because this was red primer. The rest has all been painted on over the primer.
Okay.
And to use primer on its own, not a good idea. Not when you're doing the wash on it. It just doesn't take it properly.
So you put the wash directly over the primer without putting a finish coat over top of the primer?
Well, yeah, because I have 3 different colors of brick. These two are the same. This one's different up here, and this one's different again.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that orange color. And you've got a lot of variability in the brick, too. That's the thing I've kind of fallen in love with, is that
there's a fire escape goes on this.
Awesome. Are you going to use the Teachy kit, or are you going to use the wood kit from Nick?
I'm going to use the Teachy, I think. I'll be right back.
Yeah, I think I probably do lean a little bit more to the, even though I'm not generally a fan of styrene, I think I'm more a fan of using the Teachy kit and I may end up doing part of the stairwells with on some of the other structures with the Teachy stuff. The brass, the finesse of the brass is pretty unarguable so far.
Okay. I got to say goodnight.
Good night, Ralph.
We'll catch you guys later.
All right, we're a little over time, a few minutes over anyway, but I did want to get this completely soldered so I can show you, walk through some of the soldering techniques. Next month we'll come back. We'll be on interiors, probably bring the vast majority of overall construction of our kit to completion. And so look for us next month in March. We'll have that date posted ahead of that show release. Thanks everybody for joining us, and good night.